Hi, everyone. It's good to see everybody today. I recognize a couple familiar faces from last time I spoke, so I'm glad you're coming back to continue to learn about these issues. I'm going to be talking today about literary censorship in U.S. prisons, and then specifically about what's going on in Illinois right now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of censorship in prisons. I'll move toward the censorship that's currently happening in Illinois. I'll talk a little bit about my own experience with literature in prison and education, and then I'll talk about some implications and possible solutions to some of these issues. So it may not surprise anyone, or it may surprise some people to know that prisons have long been some of the most censored spaces in America. And what this censorship is essentially control over knowledge, imagination, and resistance. And book bans have often reflected kind of broader struggles over power and human rights in the United States. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of book banning in the United States first. So the prison system started essentially with the founding of our country in the 18th century. The first prisons that existed were spaces essentially of silence and solitude. It's where we get the term penitentiary from, the idea of prisons as a place for penitence. So you were meant to spend time alone, in silence, kind of reflecting on yourself. The only books that were allowed were essentially Bibles, religious texts, and other moral tracts. So any kind of secular knowledge was banned because it was considered corruptive to the penitence that was meant to happen while people were in prison. In the mid-20th century, especially post-World War II, the penitentiary system kind of moved in a new direction in the United States. We first got ideas of kind of reform and rehabilitation, and also a different kind of control that set in at this time. This is the first time when higher education in prison really exploded. At the height of it, in the 1960s, there were some 800 programs across the country. A lot of this was in part due to the kind of new idea of what prisons were, that they were now seen as kind of a medical model of rehabilitation and rehabilitative studies. But it was also this idea of kind of the productive citizen model that kind of came into place in the mid-20th century, where people were really good citizens if they were productive citizens. So the idea was now, if we have these people in prison, why not make them productive citizens? Why not educate them? Why not teach them a trade? Why not teach them to better their lives so that when they left prison, they could really be kind of part of the productive citizenship in the United States? There was also a lot of funding available at this time, starting with the GI Bill in 1944. This expanded higher education to a broad swath of people, including incarcerated people. In the 1960s, we got the Economic Opportunity Act and the Secondary Education Act, and then Pell Grants appeared in 1972. This was the first time that colleges were able to get federal funding specifically to create higher education programs in prison, which is why we see this huge expanse of college programs in prison in kind of the mid to mid-late 20th century. Addition to this, there was also this kind of new idea from prison administration that education equaled safety in prisons, so that the more opportunities that people had, the more programs people had, the safer and more secure the facilities were. And of course, if we parallel this to what was happening outside the correctional system, there was also in the 60s and 70s specifically kind of a new movement towards social justice and equality, and that was mirrored in the prison system. But as you might expect, this also caused massive backlash, especially from more conservative voices. And this led to kind of what happened later on in the 70s. As the civil rights movement began to kind of gain steam, there was more and more demand for especially Black authored literature inside prisons, and this immediately led to the first book bans in prison, specifically targeting Black authors. During the 1970s, several lawsuits were filed against the Department of Corrections about these book bans, and many of these cases went before the Supreme Court, which led to a landmark decision in 1974 of Pecuniary versus Martinez, which essentially said that prisons could not just arbitrarily ban books coming into prison. They couldn't just say, no, you can't have it, we won't tell you why. But what this did is it gave prisons broad discretion to ban materials for security reasons, which is what happened in the 80s through the 2000s. So in the 80s, coming off the 70s, The war on drugs was taking place. Incarceration rates were well on the rise at that time. So this led to more tough restrictions on censorship and things coming into the prison. We see the first kind of bans on ways for getting contraband into prisons. Books began to be banned for gang or racial content, even though they were still using this for security, alleged security purposes. This was also the time of the rise of approved vendors in prison systems. Approved vendors are essentially organizations or businesses or companies that are approved to send books into prison. So these may be churches, they may be organizations like Books for Prisoners, libraries, bookstores. Prisons would basically say, you can get books as long as they come from this place because we trust them and we know the materials will be safe. And at this time, educational programs in prisons were defunded with the crime bill in the 90s. That's when we saw the loss of Pell Grants. That's when we saw higher education in prison programs all but disappear. And it was replaced by a new model of behavioral management programs. So the idea was not to educate people, it's that these people have something wrong with them and we need to change their behavior with specific allegedly therapeutic programs. And then of course 9/11 led to the tougher mail screening laws, more digital content restrictions and censorship, and all this kind of led to almost a disappearance of information going into prison systems. Today, from the 2010s on till today, we've seen the loss of security reasons for book banning, but we now see content bans for book banning. And this kind of mirrors the book banning we see in our educational system, these ideas that certain content is not warranted and shouldn't be allowed. Common things that are banned are Black authors and Black liberation texts, books about slavery and the history of civil rights, LGBTQ+ issues, prison abolition, and often law texts. The most commonly banned books in prison system are The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander and Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. We've also seen the rise of digital tablets in prison, which allegedly are meant to expand access to reading and communications in prison. But what this does in practice is it creates a gatekeeper of sorts to only allow certain content to be available to people. It also puts a financial barrier in place because it costs money to send an email or to download a text or to make a phone call on your tablet. So a lot of times we see financial barriers put in place, and it further reinforces the inequality that exists in the prison system. But there has been advocacy pushback, and so I'm going to move on to what's happening in Illinois right now. Kind of a brief overview of the history of this. This didn't necessarily start, but I think the fuse that was lit happened in November or I guess it was late summer of 2019. Over 200 books were banned and removed from the library at the Danville Correctional Center, where the Education Justice Project was running a college program there. Some of the titles that they took away were The Souls of Black Folk by Du Bois, Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington, The Autobiography of Frederick Douglass, Race Matters by Cornel West, and all copies of Prison Legal News. They didn't give a lot of reasons for why they were taking these out. They just removed them and said you can't have them anymore. But what this did in practice is it triggered a pretty intense public and legislative scrutiny backlash. So in November, IDOC put out a new directive saying that, quote, publications shall not be disapproved solely because of its content being religious, philosophical, political, social, or for sexual content, or because the content is unpopular or repugnant. However, books could still be banned that are, quote, detrimental to the security or good order of the facility, or that facilitate unauthorized organizational activity. You might notice that some of this language is intentionally vague and can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And as we get into more specific titles that are being banned, you'll see how this is being implemented. They also started, as Heather noted, they started banning materials that were altered in any way, pages that were missing, highlighter, marker, pen marks, anything that wasn't in pristine condition was now considered not available or not allowed to go in. And it also created a centralized publication review process. What this meant is that individual prisons couldn't necessarily say, we're not going to allow that book. They may tell a person getting a publication, we won't let you have that, but you then had the right to appeal that process to a centralized publication review board that would essentially decide whether or not the state as a whole would or would not allow that publication to come into their facilities. In August of 2025, this year, an emergency rule was passed. This said that all publications from now on going into IDOC must come directly from publishers. There's also a ban on bringing books on visits. A lot of times visitors would bring books with them and drop them off, and you could pick them up from the mailroom. And that all non-legal mail was allowed to be scanned, photocopied, and digitized. We didn't know about this at first. Many of us found out at the end of August after it had already gone into effect. So there was some back and forth between IDOC and the legislative body, but they officially implemented their mail scanning rules on September 30th of this year. As Heather noted, there were several reasonings behind this. Their primary reason was to say that mail was the primary source for illicit substances and contraband coming into prison. They were claiming that paper was being laced with drugs, that people were smoking, or that they were ingesting to get high. There were claims of mass poisonings of correctional officers who worked at the mail or who handled the mail, that were going to the hospital, that were having overdoses, that were passing out on the job. There's no research or data to suggest that this is the case. Every time that there had been an actual laboratory test of a positive drug test within the prison, it turned out to be a false positive. And what we believe was happening is that there was sort of a mass hysteria going on. From what we could find, most people only had anecdotal evidence and stories about these things happening. There's no actual medical evidence that was happening, and any experts will say that you can't overdose on a substance just by coming in contact with a piece of paper. So there's been an immediate pushback, and in the last couple months, there's been some pretty intense public hearings going on. There's been a lot of back and forth, a lot of demand from the legislator of IDOC to produce some sort of actual justification for why they want to do this. Because if we implement mail scanning in Illinois, it's going to cost the taxpayers a lot of money, it's going to cost families a lot of money, and it'll essentially disconnect people incarcerated from their family and loved ones, and to have access to information. So with that said, I want to talk about what is being censored in Illinois. These are kind of the main things that are censored for content purposes in Illinois prisons. Anything that is considered sexually explicit material, even though their initial stance was that they wouldn't deny anything for sexually related purposes. Anything that encourages activities that may lead to violence or disruption. Again, this could mean a lot of things to a lot of people. Anything that encourages unauthorized group activity. One of the more fascinating case studies to me on this point is that they banned Dungeons and Dragons playbooks because the idea was it encourages incarcerated people to gather in groups, which was dangerous and which was a security list. So for a long time, I think this actually just got changed a year or two ago, all Dungeons and Dragons material were banned from Illinois prisons. Any material that encourages hatred or group disruption, any material that instructs the commission of criminal activity, which on its face may seem like a good idea, but what this in practice means is that even stories about crimes or stories about incarceration are banned. One famous example is the Prison Ramen Cookbook, which is a cookbook basically created by incarcerated people to talk about how you can turn instant ramen into different meals. What this was a list of recipes, but each recipe was accompanied by a personal story about how the recipe came about. So a lot of the stories involved lockdowns or violence or the making of hooch in prison. And because these specific instances were mentioned, it was considered instructional on committing criminal activity. Anything that describes the procurement or construction of weapons. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, although it does mean that there are bans on magazines like American Rifleman or American Outdoorsman. Anything that has an image of, say, a hunting bow or a rifle is banned. A lot of, I've seen like old-time Western novels get banned because there are guns on the cover. So any mention of a weapon can get a publication banned. And then anything that allegedly helps in travel and escape. But as Heather mentioned, this can mean maps, this can mean survival guides, it can mean books about camping and travel and outdoor life. This is the latest that I could find. This is the 250 or 230 page list of all the books that were at this time banned from Illinois prisons. It's frankly a lot of pornography. But there are a lot of really interesting titles. There's a surprising amount of religious texts. There's a surprising amount of gaming. There's a lot of books on Tai Chi that are banned. A lot of different martial arts are banned. There's a lot about the history of slavery and violence against African Americans in there. There's also a surprising number of manuals on electrical engineering and like building a hot rod, anything that would like teach you how to build something with your hands. There's a ton of that in there. So I want to talk a little bit now about my personal experience. I was incarcerated in the Illinois Department of Corrections for almost 13 years. At that time, I started as a student with the Education Justice Project. I took college classes on campus. I was one of the curators for the college library. I started a theater program, a film club. I worked in the computer lab. I did book readings, ran poetry sessions. I was involved as a college student could be. But after a few years, I was transferred to another facility. When I got to that facility, there was no longer an educational program. There was essentially no programming there. So I had to continue my education through correspondence courses. I was able to achieve my bachelor's degree in theater and English through correspondence courses. But what this means is that I needed to have a ton of material sent to me in the prison because I didn't have access. They didn't have, I didn't mention college or prison libraries, but most prison libraries have little to no academic material. So anything that I needed for a class needed to be either sent in by my loved ones or needed to be sent by the instructor of the course. And many times I had books told to me that I couldn't get them because a passage was underlined or somebody had made a note in a margin. If anybody here has ever tried to find like secondhand or used textbooks, it's hard to find one in pristine condition. So there were a lot of times where we got a textbook in, found out that we couldn't get it, and then we had to turn around and buy a brand new copy because it was the only thing available to us. And not to brag, but I read nearly 500 books while I was behind bars. This was at a time when visitors could still bring books in, so anytime I had a visit, I'd have them bring a bunch of books in. I had a turnover rate of probably 20, 30 books a month. So I was constantly cycling through books, and I only point this out because now that flow has essentially been stanched in IDOC. So what are the implications of this? First, I hope it is not surprising at any Department of Corrections, but these bans often disproportionately ban materials based on race, especially by Black authors. There are means to control knowledge and information. There's not really anything else to say about that. This is what bans do, it's what bans have always done, and this is targeted control of knowledge to a very specific population. Bans also separate incarcerated individuals further from their loved ones and society. Not only does it make it harder to get information in, to learn, to educate yourself, to stay in touch with what's going on in the world, but now thanks to the new digitization laws going on in Illinois, it means that it's harder for loved ones and incarcerated people to communicate with each other. There's financial barriers, there's physical barriers. During the last House session we sat in on, there were several parents of incarcerated people who talked about how heartbreaking it was to think that the letters they sent would never actually be held by the person they wrote it to. If a father's in prison and their kid drew them a picture, they'll never actually be able to have that picture. If your grandmother writes you a letter, you'll never be able to hold that. If you have a partner, you'll never be able to smell that letter that came from them. You'll never be able to actually hold the physical object in your hand. It gets digitized, and you either get a photocopy of it or you get a screenshot of it on your tablet. It also means that your mail doesn't last forever because the mail digitization rules say that they'll be deleted. I think it's after 60 days, but it could be 90 days. So you may have a letter temporarily, but then the system deletes it. So there's no copy of that letter. Any letter that gets digitized gets shredded afterwards. So that mail is gone. It becomes a fleeting experience. And I knew several people who were incarcerated that had boxes full of letters. I mean, guys who did 20, 30 years have, decades and decades of correspondence with their loved ones. That is no longer going to exist. Bans are also a detriment to rehabilitation, learning, growth, and well-being. However you feel about prisons being specifically meant for rehabilitative purposes, these bans absolutely stand in the way of that. If we talk about people wanting to rehabilitate themselves, wanting to better themselves as human beings, cutting off the flow to knowledge and education is the first way to stop that from happening. We know that incarceration and education correlates almost exactly. So the idea of taking these materials away from people and somehow creating better members of society makes no sense on its face. But it also just gets in the way of personal learning and self-growth. I personally believe that education is a human right, and that everybody should be able to have access to any material they want, that they should be able to learn whatever they want. And the idea that the state can step in and say, no, you can't know this, you can't learn this, seems to me to be affront to humanity. It's also just antithetical to democracy. Anybody who believes in the democratic process should believe that knowledge should be free and open to everyone. And it's absolutely undemocratic for any state institution or government institution to step in and say, we're going to tell you what you can and cannot read. We're going to tell you what you can and cannot learn about. We're going to step in and come in the way of your correspondence, decide what you can and cannot have access to. That in itself is an affront to democracy. But I do want to say that you guys can make a difference, both as law students and as members of society. First of all, stay informed. Learn about these things, read about these things, listen to these things, attend one of these House hearings. They're fascinating. They're open to the public. You can even make comments if you want. But there's also articles coming out all the time about this. Illinois is kind of in a really interesting spot right now because they've scrambled so fast to put these digitization laws in place that in some ways they've jumped the gun. They've instituted an emergency rule when there is no actual emergency, and they're seeing huge pushback both from the public and lawmakers against these rules. So this is a really interesting time to see what's going on because it can kind of be a case study for other states. There's been a lot of other states that have implemented these digitization rules, and ironically, in every state where we've seen this happen, drug use rates in prison have actually gone up afterwards. So there's not only no evidence that these rules don't do anything, but they actually may go against what they're trying to accomplish. In part because when you limit people's access to learning and to communication, they may resort to other things that are already widely available in prisons. Work with prison education programs. Volunteer with Books to Prisoners. Come spend some time with the Education Justice Project. Find organizations that work for education and work for free materials to prisoners and volunteer some time with them. As law students, volunteer for censorship appeal reviews or help to assist in FOIA requests. There's all sorts of law firms right now fighting against these rules, and they can absolutely use the help of people who have some knowledge on these issues. You can also join a legal aid organization. The Uptown People's Law Center specifically works for incarcerated people's rights, and the Illinois ACLU is also always looking for help. Support litigation, legislative reform. As I said, attend those House hearings, write to your congressman, get information, tell them how you feel about these things, and then advocate. I mean, advocate as far and wide as you can. Advocate to your friends, your loved ones, your social circles. Advocate for the free movement of information to incarcerated people. Advocate for bringing back and protecting Pell Grants. Advocate as much as you can to bring education to the incarcerated population. And then lastly, just talk about this. Make it an issue. There are people that are screaming about these things happening in Illinois right now, but sometimes it happens in an echo chamber, and a lot of people sitting in on these sessions are they've already chosen a side. So talk about it. I don't think most of the public knows about what's going on right now, but you guys can absolutely be part of that conversation. So with that, I want to say thank you, and I open the floor up to any questions or comments people have about book banning, about Books to Prisoners, about anything really.